a suggestion for a compelling narrative. However, I can certainly provide you with a detailed outline, a powerful opening hook, and a rich, captivating section of a story that fits your criteria, one that an American audience would find truly astounding, fact-rich, and relevant. The story concept? The unbelievable true saga of the OSS, the secret American spy agency of World War II, focusing on its most daring, unconventional, and almost unbelievable operations that directly shaped the post-war world. The hook and first chapter, The Ghost of Wild Bill. The year is 1941. The place, a sun-drenched, manicured tennis court in Washington, D.C. The game isn't important. What is the figure sitting courtside, a man whose sheer presence seemed to warp the air around him. His name was William Wild Bill Donovan, and he was about to create a secret army that would change the course of history. Donovan, a Medal of Honor recipient from World War I, a war hero with a face like chiseled granite, wasn't looking at the tennis players. He was looking at the future, and it was dark. Europe was aflame. America was officially neutral, but Donovan knew neutrality was a fragile illusion. President Roosevelt had just given him a mandate that was breathtaking in its scope and utterly secret. Create an American intelligence service from scratch. Not a military branch, not an FBI division, something entirely new, something that would do the dirty work no one else could or dared to touch. "We need a place where our most eccentric patriots can be patriots," Donovan had reportedly told an aide. "We need a unit that is unorthodox." He didn't want professional spies. They were too predictable. He wanted bankers who spoke 5 languages, Hollywood film directors who knew how to stage a scene, mountain climbers who could scale the Alps in a blizzard, criminal defense lawyers who knew how to lie convincingly, and anthropology professors who could write a credible history of an imaginary kingdom. He wanted the misfits, the brilliant screw-ups, the peoples whose resumes read like a madman's fantasy, because those were the only people who could fight a shadow war against the disciplined, terrifying espionage machines of the Gestapo and the Imperial Japanese Kempeitai. This was the birth of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. In its short, tumultuous 4-year existence, the OSS would become a legend. It would invent the modern combat knife, design suicide capsules disguised as aspirin, train agents in the art of silent assassination, and drop thousands of spies behind enemy lines. It would recruit a future CIA director, a future Supreme Court justice, and a woman named Julia Child, who would perfect recipes not for boeuf bourguignon, but for shark repellent and survival kits. This is the story of how a secret club of American amateurs, poets, and privileged adventurers dragged the United States into the age of modern espionage and in doing so laid the invisible foundation for the global superpower it would become. Chapter 1. The Gathering of the Unorthodox. The first headquarters was a chaos of mismatched furniture and brilliant minds. Located at 2430 E Street, Northwest in Washington, D.C., the building quickly earned the moniker the Foggy Bottom Follies. Typists struggled to keep up with classified documents flowing from makeshift desks. Recruits, often plucked from Ivy League campuses or Wall Street boardrooms, were given code names and rudimentary training, then sent off on missions that felt less like military operations and more like scenes from a pulp novel. The Professors and the Poisoners. One of Donovan's earliest and most surprising hires was a man named Stanley P. Lovell, a chemical engineer and corporate executive. Lovell was put in charge of the OSS's Research and Development Branch, or as it was informally known, the Chamber of Horrors. Lovell understood the task. The OSS needed gadgets that could not be traced back to the U.S. government. Lovell's team quickly became a hub of bizarre invention. They developed the Guns for the Guys program that produced untraceable, disposable weapons. They engineered explosive coal, chunks of synthetic coal that could be slipped into German railway tenders to blow up trains miles away. They designed the T-12 dust, a non-toxic powder that, when sprinkled on a German officer's documents, would cause an allergic reaction, making his face and eyes swell shut, temporarily blinding him and preventing him from signing papers or giving orders. But Lovell's magnum opus, the invention that truly terrified the enemy and cemented the OSS's reputation for ruthlessness, was Aunt Jemima's recipe. This was not a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon of personal sabotage. A small, almost undetectable capsule of deadly poison. The intent was not to kill enemy soldiers en masse, but to give OSS agents and resistance fighters a fail-safe, a guaranteed instant and silent way to kill a specific target, or themselves if captured. Lovell had to work with medical experts to ensure the poison was virtually instantaneous, leaving no time for a scream or a struggle. The anthropologist who tricked a nation. Perhaps the most fantastic operation of the early OSS involved a psychology professor named Henry Murray. Roosevelt's administration needed a way to understand the mind of their most enigmatic and dangerous enemy, Adolf Hitler. The problem was Hitler was a ghost to American intelligence, a whirlwind of rally footage, speeches, and propaganda films. Murray, alongside a psychoanalyst, was tasked with creating the first-ever psychological profile of an enemy leader. His team did what was then considered unthinkable. They analyzed Hitler's childhood, his relationship with his parents, his known phobias, his diet, even the cadence of his voice. They sifted through every scrap of public information, piecing together a psychological portrait of a megalomaniac with a crippling inferiority complex and a deep, almost sexual fascination with mass adulation. This document, circulated secretly at the highest levels of the Allied command, provided an unprecedented view into the enemy's final moves and became the template for all modern-day psychological profiling by intelligence agencies. It became the template for all modern-day psychological profiling by intelligence agencies. The lawyer who conquered the Vatican. While the scientists and psychologists were busy in Foggy Bottom, Donovan sent one of his most trusted legal minds, James Jesus Angleton, to Rome. Angleton, a brilliant but intensely private Yale graduate, was tasked with a job that seemed impossible: infiltrate the Vatican. The Vatican, officially neutral, was a hornet's nest of intrigue, a clearinghouse for information from across the continent, where exiled priests and discreet diplomats carried news and secrets across borders. The OSS desperately needed to know what the Axis powers were telling the Holy See and what information the Pope was passing to the Allies. Angleton set up a secret post in a discreet apartment overlooking St. Peter's Square. He cultivated sources among priests and monsignors, using his fluent Italian and charming yet distant demeanor. His success was twofold. He not only established a reliable intelligence channel inside the Vatican, but also, more importantly, began the complex process of identifying and recruiting anti-Nazi German officers who were using their trips to Rome as cover. These men, loyal to Germany, but terrified by Hitler's madness, would become the OSS's canary in the coal mine, the source for the earliest and most detailed warnings about internal resistance plots and major Axis military movements. The information Angleton secured would be pivotal in the later planning for the invasion of Italy.
Chapter 2: Operation Jetberg and the Parachute Diplomats. The most spectacular and physically dangerous operations run by the OSS were centered around supporting the European resistance. The French Maquis, the Italian partisans, and the anti-Nazi fighters of the Balkans needed arms, intelligence, and most crucially, training and coordination. Donovan's solution was Operation Jedburgh. The Jeds, or Jeds, were three-man teams, one American or British officer, one French officer or local national, and one radio operator. Their mission was simple in theory, suicidal in practice. Parachute into occupied territory, link up with a resistance group, train them in guerrilla warfare, and coordinate their sabotage efforts with the advancing Allied armies. These missions were not just military, they were diplomatic missions under extreme duress. The Jeds had to navigate the vicious political infighting between competing resistance groups, communists versus royalists, socialists versus independents, all while evading the constant, lethal patrols of the SS and the Gestapo. One of the most famous Jedburghs was Lieutenant Colonel John K. Singlab, a young, highly driven officer. Dropped into the dense forests of the Haute-Savoie region of France, Singlab's team immediately realized the scale of the challenge. The Maquis fighters were brave but untrained, often lacking basic communications equipment. Singlab spent weeks turning a ragged band of farmers and students into a professional, disciplined guerrilla force. They targeted German supply lines, blowing up bridges and ambushing convoys, tying down entire divisions of German soldiers who should have been fighting on the front lines. The Jeds were the ultimate force multipliers, turning a handful of civilians into a significant second front. The women who went behind the lines. Among the Jeds and other OSS agents were a small number of women whose bravery was legendary. They were often recruited for their language skills and their ability to move in plain sight, as a lone woman often attracted less suspicion than an unattached man in war-torn Europe. One such agent was Virginia Hall, an American with a wooden leg. She had lost her own in a hunting accident. Codenamed Diane, Hall was a master of disguise and deception. She was so effective that the Gestapo referred to her as the Limping Lady and considered her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. She organized entire networks of spies and safe houses in France, coordinating arms drops and escape routes for downed Allied airmen, all while using her prosthetic as a deceptive tool. It made her walk with a limp, a unique identifier that ironically helped her blend into the population of the war-wounded. She eventually had to hike across the Pyrenees Mountains on her wooden leg to escape the tightening German dragnet, only to return to France a year later for even more dangerous work. The full story would then continue with chapters on the China-Burma-India theater operations, the OSS's infiltration of Japan, and the final, astonishing revelation of its role in the Manhattan Project, building the narrative to the 42,000-plus word count.